Linda Harrison gripped her phone tightly, her breath uneven as she paced near the window. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the suburban street, but all she could focus on was the man standing outside. His head was lowered, eyes locked onto his phone, fingers moving rapidly across the screen. He had been there for too long, too still, too focused. She took a sharp breath and dialed. The line clicked. 911. What's your emergency? Linda pressed her lips together, her voice coming out in a rushed whisper. There's a suspicious man outside my house. I think he's up to something. The dispatcher's voice remained calm. What exactly is he doing? He's just standing there, looking around, typing something on his phone. I don't know what he's doing, but it doesn't look right. A pause. Does he have a weapon? Linda hesitated, watching as the man adjusted his stance. She couldn't see anything in his hands besides the phone, but still, her gut told her something was wrong. I don't know, she admitted, but I feel like he's watching someone, maybe even hacking something. Stay on the line, ma'am. Officers are on their way. Somewhere in the distance, the wail of sirens began to rise, cutting through the quiet neighborhood air. But what happens next will shock everyone. Don't look away. This story is just getting started. If you think assumptions like this need to be exposed, hit that subscribe button and stay until the end. Jamal Carter sat at his desk, the soft hum of his computer filling the quiet of his Brooklyn townhouse. He had just wrapped up a long morning of troubleshooting for a client, and now all he wanted was a short break before diving back into work. He stretched his arms, grabbed his phone, and decided to check something that had been bothering him for days: his Wi-Fi connection. Lately, it had been slower than usual. Files took longer to upload, video calls lagged, and streaming music sometimes buffered. He assumed it was just his internet provider acting up, but today, he had had enough. He pulled up the router settings on his phone and began scanning the list of connected devices. His brows furrowed. There it was again, an unfamiliar device labeled Broadwood 101. That didn't belong to him. Jamal lived alone, and aside from his laptop, phone, and smart TV, no other device should be using his Wi-Fi. He sighed, shaking his head. Someone had been leeching off his internet. Tapping a few buttons, he disconnected every unrecognized device and quickly generated a new password. He stepped outside onto his small porch for a stronger signal, the cool autumn breeze brushing against his skin as he entered the updated credentials into his phone. He didn't think much of it. It was a small nuisance, easily handled. But from across the street, someone else saw things differently. Linda Harrison, seated by her kitchen window, set down her coffee cup, her eyes narrowing. She had lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years and took pride in knowing everything that happened on her block. She believed that keeping an eye on things was her civic duty. And right now, Jamal looked suspicious. He wasn't like the other neighbors. He didn't join community gatherings, never stopped to chat, and always kept to himself. That, to Linda, made him an outsider. Now, he was standing outside, glued to his phone, fingers moving rapidly across the screen. Her mind jumped to the worst conclusions. Is he watching someone? Hacking into something? Stealing information? She squinted, watching him glance up and look around for a brief moment. That was all the confirmation she needed. Her breath hitched as she grabbed her phone. The weight of responsibility pressed on her. If she didn't report this, who would? 911, what's your emergency? There's a man outside, Linda said quickly, voice hushed but urgent. He's standing near my house. He looks suspicious. The dispatcher on the other end remained professional. Can you describe him? Linda's eyes flicked toward Jamal again. Tall, black, mid-40s. He's holding his phone, typing something fast. I don't know what, but he keeps looking around like he's checking if someone's watching. The dispatcher's tone stayed neutral. Is he armed? Linda hesitated. She couldn't see a weapon. But that didn't mean he wasn't dangerous. I I don't know, she admitted. But I think he's up to something. He could be hacking into something or tracking someone. The dispatcher's response was swift. Stay inside, ma'am. Officers are on their way. A tight breath left Linda's lips. She had done her part. Outside, Jamal, unaware of the watchful eyes behind the curtain, tapped his screen one last time and exhaled in satisfaction. His network was secure again. Problem solved. Then, from a distance, came the unmistakable sound of sirens. The air around him seemed to tighten as flashing red and blue lights reflected off the houses down the street. He frowned, glancing up. That can't be for me, can it? The sirens grew louder, bouncing off the brownstones and echoing through the quiet Brooklyn street. Jamal turned toward the flashing lights, confusion knitting his brows, as a black and white patrol car rolled to a stop right in front of his house. His stomach clenched. 2 officers stepped out. The first, Lieutenant Nathan Brooks, moved with quiet authority. He was broad-shouldered, his face etched with years of experience. His sharp eyes scanned the surroundings before settling on Jamal. Beside him, Officer Erica Lopez was smaller in frame, but carried herself with an undeniable confidence. She took in the scene quickly, her expression unreadable. Jamal forced himself to remain calm. He had done nothing wrong. Brooks approached first, his tone firm but neutral. Sir, we received a report about suspicious activity in this area. Can you tell us what you're doing? Jamal exhaled slowly, keeping his voice measured. I was just changing my Wi-Fi password. Before Brooks could respond, a voice cut through the tension. He's lying! Jamal turned just in time to see Linda Harrison storming out of her house, her robe billowing as she marched toward them. Her face was flushed, eyes wild with conviction. I saw him standing there for almost an hour, just staring at his phone and looking around like he was checking if someone was watching. He's up to something, Jamal blinked, disbelief flashing across his face. An hour? He had been outside for less than 10 minutes. Brooks glanced between them, his lips pressing into a thin line. He turned back to Jamal. Sir, do you live here? Jamal nodded. Yes, that's my house. My name's on the lease. My car is parked right there. Brooks didn't respond immediately. Instead, he exchanged a glance with Lopez, who was already scanning the property. Can I see some ID? Jamal clenched his jaw. He knew where this was going. He had seen it play out 1,000 times before, with people who looked like him. But he also knew pushing back wouldn't help. Keeping his movements slow and deliberate, he reached into his back pocket, pulled out his wallet, and handed over his driver's license. Brooks took it, glancing down at the name before handing it back. Thank you. Jamal exhaled, thinking it was over, until Lopez spoke up. Do you mind if we check your phone? Jamal stiffened. Brooks, noticing the shift in his demeanor, lifted a hand in reassurance. It's just to clear this up quickly. If there's nothing suspicious, we'll be out of your hair. Jamal's pulse thrummed in his ears. His instinct screamed at him to refuse. Why should he have to prove his innocence when he hadn't done anything wrong? But he knew how situations like this escalated. And he was standing outside, in his own front yard, with 2 cops, and a woman who was determined to paint him as a criminal. So, he inhaled deeply, pulled up his router settings, and handed the phone over. Lopez took it, scrolling through the list of recently connected devices. Her brows pulled together. There's a device still connected. Jamal frowned. That's impossible. I reset everything. Brooks peered over her shoulder. Broadwood 101. Jamal's blood ran cold. That was the same device name he had seen before, the one he thought he had kicked off his network. A heavy silence settled over them. Linda, oblivious to the weight of the moment, crossed her arms smugly. See? I told you he was hacking something. Jamal shot her a sharp look. That's not mine, Linda scoffed. Of course you'd say that. Lopez, ignoring the back and forth, tapped on the device. This is still actively running. Brooks's demeanor shifted slightly, the easygoing approach replaced by something more serious. Sir, are you aware of what this device is connected to? Jamal shook his head. Number. But I'd like to find out. Linda folded her arms. Maybe he's watching people through their cameras. That's what hackers do, right? Lopez glanced at her. Ma'am, do you have home security cameras? Linda tilted her chin up. Of course I do. High-quality ones, too. Lopez nodded toward her. Can you check if they're active? Linda smirked, pulling out her phone with exaggerated confidence. She tapped her security app, probably expecting to see a crisp live feed of her empty driveway. But instead, the screen froze. Her brows furrowed. She tapped again. Then, her face drained of color. What's wrong? Brooks asked. Linda swallowed. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper. There's already a live feed open. The officers leaned in. Jamal did too. On the screen was a grainy, real-time view of her own living room. Someone had been watching her. The smugness disappeared from Linda's face instantly, replaced by raw fear. Lopez turned back to Jamal. You said you didn't recognize that device? Jamal, still staring at Linda's screen, shook his head slowly. Number. But I think we just found out what it's been doing. A heavy pause. Then Brooks straightened, his expression unreadable. We need to track the source of that connection. Right now. The energy shifted entirely. Just moments ago, Jamal had been a suspect. Now, suddenly, he wasn't. But what none of them realized yet, what none of them could possibly know, was that the person behind this wasn't far at all. He was right in their own neighborhood, and he had been watching for a long, long time. Brooks and Lopez exchanged a look, the weight of the situation settling in. What had started as a simple report of suspicious activity had quickly unraveled into something far more serious. Jamal took back his phone, staring at the screen. His own Wi-Fi had been compromised. Linda's security cameras had been accessed. But by who? And for how long? Lopez spoke first. We need to track where that device is sending data. Jamal nodded, already tapping into his router logs. He wasn't a hacker, but as an IT specialist, he knew his way around networks better than most. He pulled up the connection history and scanned through the list of logged activity. His eyes narrowed. There's an IP address here that doesn't belong to me, he said, angling his phone so the officers could see. It's bouncing off a masked VPN, but I can trace the local network origin. Brooks folded his arms. Do it. Jamal's fingers flew across his screen. He bypassed the VPN mask, filtering through the signal strength and frequency logs. His heartbeat quickened as the results narrowed. Then, there it was. His jaw tightened. It's coming from a house just a few doors down. Brooks leaned in. Which one? Jamal hesitated for a second, then exhaled. That one. He pointed across the street, to a two-story home with a well-manicured lawn and a porch light glowing dimly in the evening haze. Linda followed his gaze, her confusion turning to visible disbelief. No, she whispered. Jamal didn't need to say the name. She already knew. Brandon, her nephew. Linda shook her head, stepping back as if trying to physically reject the idea. That's impossible. Brandon wouldn't do something like this. Lopez's expression remained neutral, but her posture shifted slightly, bracing for what was coming. Ma'am, she said carefully, do you live with him? Linda's throat bobbed. He's been staying with me for a few months. He's in college. He barely leaves his room most days. He's a good kid. Brooks's gaze hardened. A good kid who might be spying on the entire neighborhood. Linda's lips parted, but no words came. Jamal didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. He had been accused, humiliated, and treated like a criminal. And now, the real threat had been right under Linda's nose all along. "We need to talk to him," Lopez said. Linda hesitated, glancing at Jamal, as if searching for an explanation, one that would clear her nephew of any wrongdoing. Jamal met her eyes, his voice firm. "I told you it wasn't me." Brooks took the lead, motioning for Lopez to follow. "Let's go." Jamal, still holding his phone, took a step forward. "I'm coming too." Brooks stopped and turned. "Number you, stay here." Jamal clenched his jaw, but he knew better than to argue. He had done enough. Now, it was the police's job to handle the rest. Brooks and Lopez crossed the street, their hands instinctively resting near their belts, not on their weapons, but close enough. Linda followed behind them, slower, hesitant. They reached the porch. The house was quiet. No movement behind the curtains. Brooks knocked hard. "Brandon Harrison, this is the police. We need to speak with you." Silence. Lopez knocked again. Nothing. Linda stepped forward, voice unsteady. "Brandon? Honey?" Still nothing. Brooks gave Lopez a look. She nodded. "We're coming in," Brooks announced. "Ma'am, do you have a key?" Linda fumbled in her pocket, pulling out a set of keys with shaky fingers. She unlocked the door, but Brooks was the one who pushed it open. The house was eerily still. Brooks moved in first, Lopez covering his flank. Linda hesitated before stepping inside, her hands trembling. The living room was neat, almost too neat. A textbook lay open on the coffee table, a half-empty soda can beside it. It was the kind of scene that suggested normalcy. But something was off. Lopez motioned toward the hallway. "Where's his room?" Linda swallowed hard. "Upstairs." They moved as one, the air growing heavier with each step. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar. A faint blue glow seeped from the crack. Brooks raised a hand, signaling for silence. Then, with a firm push, he swung the door open. The room was dark, except for the monitors. Rows of screens lined the desk, displaying multiple camera feeds. Living rooms, driveways, bedrooms. Linda gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Brandon sat frozen in the chair, eyes wide, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He looked like a deer caught in headlights. Lopez stepped forward. "Brandon Harrison?" Brandon swallowed. Brooks cut him off. "Step away from the desk. Hands where we can see them." Brandon hesitated for half a second, then obeyed, standing slowly. Linda's voice wavered. "Brandon, tell me this isn't what it looks like." Brandon's jaw tightened. "I wasn't doing anything bad. I was just experimenting." Brooks's patience was wearing thin. "Experimenting? You were illegally accessing security cameras across the neighborhood. That's not experimenting. That's a felony." Brandon's breathing quickened. "I wasn't hurting anyone. I got curious, okay? I didn't mean for it to go this far." Linda took a shaky step forward. "How long?" Brandon avoided her gaze. "A while." Brooks pulled out his cuffs. "Brandon Harrison, you're under arrest for unauthorized access of a computer network, wiretapping, and unlawful surveillance." Brandon's hands trembled as Lopez secured the cuffs around his wrists. Linda backed away, shaking her head. No, there has to be some mistake." Jamal stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching everything unfold. There was no mistake. And now, Linda knew exactly what it felt like to be on the wrong side of an accusation. Brooks led Brandon out, Lopez following close behind. As they passed Jamal, Brandon turned, desperation flickering in his eyes. "I didn't mean to," he muttered. Jamal stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then he shook his head. "It's too late for that." Brandon looked away. The front door opened, spilling red and blue light into the dimly lit hallway. And just like that, the real criminal was taken away. Brandon's breath came in short, panicked bursts as Lopez tightened the cuffs around his wrists. The cold steel dug into his skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the room, filled with the eerie glow of multiple computer screens. His eyes darted to his aunt, searching for some kind of salvation, some last-minute intervention that would make all of this disappear. Linda stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale, her hands trembling. She had called the police to stop what she thought was a crime, yet here she was, watching as they led her own family out of the house in handcuffs. "This is a mistake," she whispered. "There has to be another explanation." Brooks shot her a look, unimpressed. "Ma'am, we just found an entire surveillance setup in his bedroom. There's no mistake." Brandon swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he spoke. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I just wanted to see if I could do it." Lopez let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "You didn't just hack into a system, Brandon. You invaded people's privacy. You watched them without their knowledge. That's not just some experiment. That's a crime." Brandon's panic deepened. He tugged lightly against the cuffs, but Brooks's grip on his arm was firm. "I swear, I wasn't going to use anything. I was just testing things out. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Lopez's expression remained cold. "But it did." Brandon let out a sharp exhale, his head lowering. "What's going to happen to me?" Brooks didn't sugarcoat it. "You're being charged with unauthorized access to a computer network, unlawful surveillance, and wiretapping. That's federal territory. You better hope you have a damn good lawyer." Brandon's knees nearly buckled. No, please, Brooks didn't let him finish. He guided him firmly toward the door. As they passed through the living room, Brandon's eyes found Jamal, who stood near the staircase, watching it all unfold. There was no smugness in his face, no satisfaction, just quiet observation. Brandon's voice lowered, almost pleading. "I swear I didn't mean for this to happen." Jamal exhaled through his nose. He had heard those words before, from people who only regretted something once they were caught. "It's too late for that," he said simply. Brandon's face crumbled as Brooks led him out the front door, the flashing lights outside casting shadows across the walls. Linda finally moved, following them to the porch. She watched, wide-eyed and motionless, as the officers placed her nephew into the back of the squad car. The door shut with a heavy thud. The weight of it all hit her at once. Her throat tightened, her body stiff as she turned back to Jamal, who had stepped outside, standing near the sidewalk, hands in his pockets. For the first time that night she truly saw him, not as an outsider, not as a threat, but as a man who had every reason to be furious with her. Her voice trembled. I didn't know." Jamal tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Didn't know what?" Linda swallowed, her mouth suddenly dry. "That he was the one doing all of this, that I was accusing the wrong person." Jamal let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. "Didn't stop you, though, did it?" Her face burned with shame. "I was wrong," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I judged you without thinking. I should have given you the benefit of the doubt." Jamal studied her, his gaze steady, unwavering. Then, after a long moment, he shook his head. "I don't need an apology," he said. "I just need you to do better." The words landed heavily between them. Linda wanted to say more, but what was left? The damage had already been done. Jamal gave her one last look before turning and walking away, back toward his house, back to the life she had nearly upended over a false assumption. She stood there, motionless, as the squad car pulled away, the flashing red and blue lights painting streaks across her pale face. For the first time in a long time, she had nothing to say. The street was quiet again, but nothing felt the same. The flashing police lights had faded, and the commotion had settled. Yet Linda remained standing on her porch, lost in thought. The weight of her mistake pressed against her chest like an anchor. She had been so sure, so convinced that her gut feeling had to be right. But she had been wrong, terribly wrong. Across the street, Jamal stepped inside his house and shut the door without another glance. He didn't need to say anything else. His silence spoke louder than any argument ever could. How many times had this happened before? How many people had been judged unfairly, treated as threats, just because someone assumed the worst? This wasn't just about her mistake. It was about a deeper issue. How easy it was to see what you wanted to see instead of the truth. But here's the question. How often does this happen in real life? Have you ever been misjudged because of the way you look, where you're from, or just because someone felt something was off? If this story made you think, even for a second, share it. Let's talk about it. Let's challenge these assumptions. And maybe next time, someone will take a moment to ask questions before they jump to conclusions.